Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I'm super excited to see you all here today, especially since it's so lovely out. Thanks for making time on your Sunday to come and talk with us about Fallingwater. I'm Andrea Lowry. I'm the Executive Director for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and we are the state's history agency. So the State Museum of Pennsylvania is a bureau within the PHMC. And our mission here at PHMC is to share Pennsylvania history, and I'm thrilled to have you joining us today as we discuss a Pennsylvania icon, Fallingwater. I hope you've had a chance to visit our exhibit here on this floor, Seeing Fallingwater. The exhibit features an amazing model of Fallingwater from the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I'm especially thrilled to be welcoming Justin Gunther, the director of Fallingwater and the vice president of the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, to join us here today to talk about Fallingwater. Justin became director of Fallingwater in 2018, and it's hard to imagine anyone who would be more perfect to oversee this national treasure. Prior to joining Fallingwater as director, Justin served as the architectural historian for the Virginia State Capitol, was a professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design, specializing in preservation, was the manager of the restoration of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and served as Fallingwater's curator of buildings from 2007 to 2011. Today, Justin will be talking about the history of Fallingwater and its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Please join me in welcoming Justin.
Well, I just want to extend a quick thanks to Andrea Lowry, to Beth Erickson, and Kurt Miner for bringing me here to the State Museum to talk with you today. I came out from Pittsburgh this morning. The foliage is stunning, so the fact that you're inside on a beautiful fall day like today, I really appreciate you coming to hear about Fallingwater. But Fallingwater is arguably one of the most iconic and recognizable houses in the world. It was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1935 and built from 1936 to 1939 for the Kaufman family of Pittsburgh. And the house is Wright's tour de force. It's the architect's primary expression of what he called an organic architecture. For its design, Wright drew inspiration directly from nature for every element of the house. It's a unified composition where all the colors, materials, motifs, and dramatic sculptural forms are derived directly from the surrounding forest landscape. The result is a house unlike any other that has the power to demonstrate how people can respect and live in harmony with the natural world. In recognition of its architectural and cultural importance, the National Park Service designated Fallingwater to the National Register in 1974, as a National Historic Landmark in 1976, Pennsylvania recognized Fallingwater as a Commonwealth treasure in 2000, and most recently in 2019, UNESCO added Fallingwater to the World Heritage List to recognize its outstanding significance and global importance. And the primary reason that we sought out UNESCO World Heritage inscription was to secure Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy for generations to come. And because Fallingwater is Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece and one of his most emblematic works, the house has played a pivotal role in ensuring Wright's position of importance in the history of modernism and in the history of architecture from its very beginnings all the way to the present day. So today I'm going to take kind of a different approach to telling you the story of Fallingwater by talking about how Fallingwater helped to save Frank Lloyd Wright's career 3 different times, secure his relevance 3 different times. And because Frank Lloyd Wright liked theatrics, I'm going to do this kind of as a 3-act play. So we're going to do 3 acts of saving Frank Lloyd Wright through Fallingwater. So the first act is the creation story of Fallingwater, the genesis of Fallingwater. And the house's creation is a fascinating one. It's this fortuitous coming together of the perfect architect with the perfect site and the perfect clients. And these clients were ones fully willing to embrace Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas of organic architecture. And thankfully, they had the financial means to do so. The house went 5 times over budget, So it was originally to be $35,000 for a vacation house in the woods of western Pennsylvania. And if you put that into context of the period, the average house is $4,000. So this is $35,000 for a vacation house, and it ends up costing the Kaufman family $155,000. But the commission was a pivotal hinge point for Frank Lloyd Wright. If Fallingwater hadn't happened and had not been such an international success, Wright and his ideas could have largely faded away, along with his relevance and popularity. In the 1930s, Wright was in his 60s, so he was born the year after the Civil War ended, so he's really a product of the 19th century. So although he held a position of intense respect with the moderns and was still designing and lecturing, Wright had not realized a major commission in almost a decade by the 1930s. And this was partially due to the Great Depression. Building was largely at a standstill. But Wright's younger contemporaries labeled him as a grandfather of the modern movement. They called him Moses. He had helped lead the way to the Promised Land, but didn't quite make it there himself. And his naturalistic organic architecture had largely fallen out of fashion. Instead, the European internationalists with their rationalistic machines for living like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, with its cubic forms and flat white walls, was overshadowing Wright and leading the way forward in architecture. So in an effort to drum up his business and to promote his philosophy of organic architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright published an autobiography in 1932 and then started something called the Taliesin Fellowship, which was an apprenticeship program based at his Taliesin home and studio in Wisconsin to start training his next generation of disciples. And lucky for him, the Kaufman family of Pittsburgh comes into the picture at about the same time. Edgar and Lillian Kaufman were tastemakers. They traveled the world. They befriended artists and architects. They were members of the cultural elite, not just in Pittsburgh, but in New York. And they were owners of the city's largest department store, which was 11 stories tall and took up an entire city block. They had one son, Edgar Kaufman Jr., who, as a young man in his 20s, as he's trying to figure out what to do with his life, he studied design in Vienna. He apprenticed as a painter in Florence. And at the recommendation of a friend, read Frank Lloyd Wright's newly published autobiography. And he instantly fell in love with Wright's ideas of organic architecture. He'd later write that the architect's words flowed into his mind like the first drops of irrigation in a desert land. Very romantic and idealistic for a young man in his 20s. So Edgar Kaufman Jr., who's in this photo with Frank Lloyd Wright, the circle is around Edgar Kaufman Jr., he traveled to Taliesin to interview for a spot in Wright's apprenticeship program. Of course, Wright accepted him. He always could sniff out a good client. Edgar Kaufman Jr.'s parents owned one of the country's largest department stores, so his acceptance was a shoo-in. And his parents soon visited Edgar Kaufman Jr. at Taliesin. They also instantly connected with Frank Lloyd Wright and his vision of organic architecture. And Edgar Kaufman Sr. talked to Wright about civic improvements for Pittsburgh, even this idea of a planetarium for the city, a circular parking garage for the department store, an apartment tower for Mount Washington, and a project that did get executed, an executive office for himself in the department store. But in addition to having a house in Pittsburgh, along with the department store in Pittsburgh, the Kaufmans also owned a summer camp about 60 miles outside of Pittsburgh. And they used this camp as a retreat from the smog of the Steel City for the employees of the department store. And out on this landscape, there was a clubhouse, there was a racetrack, a series of sleeping cabins, a trout hatchery to stock the stream Bear Run for fly fishing. So it's really this wonderful place for recuperation outside of the city. And the Kaufmans enjoyed going out there with the employees of the store. They had their own cabin on the grounds that they called the Hangover, because it was perched on a rock ledge, but also because they liked to drink a lot and have a good time when they were out in the mountains. And this was the Prohibition, so I'm not sure where the alcohol was coming from, maybe the stills out in the hills of western Pennsylvania. But central always to the landscape were the waterfalls. And this is where the Kaufmans and the department store employees like to go for sunning, bathing, and picnicking. And after that introduction to Frank Lloyd Wright through their son, the Kaufmans started to entertain the idea of a more formal weekend house out at Bear Run to replace their hangover cabin. They wanted all the modern conveniences along with being out in the woods. And they were eager to do something different and unique and far from the normal of the day. So Wright seemed like a great choice to do that with. And Frank Lloyd Wright saw this as just the right opportunity to break from that stark European international style and do something truly organic and American and modern and do it better than the European internationalist. So Wright visited the waterfall site in December 1934 with the Kaufmans. He went back to Taliesin and started a design. And you all know the story. The Kaufmans thought they were going to get a house looking at the waterfall. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright had other ideas. He was immediately drawn to the power of the waterfalls. Wright had always been fascinated by waterfalls ever since he visited Japan in 1905. Where he spent a lot of time photographing shrines and sacred places in the landscape. And this is a woodblock print Frank Lloyd Wright had in his collection that by Hokusai that shows a Shinto shrine beside a waterfall. So for Fallingwater, Wright was going to design his own idea of this Japanese temple, a domestic one, beside a sacred space in the landscape, which was the waterfalls. So he took direct cues from nature, conceived of a house designed to the music of the stream, which was this literal symphony of sculptural cascade of structural forms, suggesting motion and rushing water. And the building grows from the boulders of the site with these cantilevers vigorously projected out into the forest, just like the rock ledges of the waterfalls. And the Kaufmans immediately embraced the idea, maybe a little initial apprehension, building over top of a waterfall, but they loved the boldness of the design. So construction starts in 1936. Here you can see the concrete bolsters or support piers rising up from the stone of the stream. All the stone for the structural walls was quarried directly from the site and then laid up in patterns that mimic the natural rock formations. And then this scaffolding was erected to make the formwork for the cantilever pours. Although if I saw this scaffold, I would have taken my checkbook and ran the other direction. Here's that formwork removed, the house largely finished. The only thing left here is to put the steel and glass in place. And Fallingwater, before it was even finished, so the furniture hadn't even been put into the house yet, it was instantly famous. It got a solo exhibition in 1938 at the Museum of Modern Art, curated by John McAndrew, their curator of architecture and design. The January issue, 1938, of Architectural Forum was completely devoted to Frank Lloyd Wright with a huge spread about Fallingwater. And then Time magazine in January of 38 puts Frank Lloyd Wright and Fallingwater on the cover of the magazine, calling the house Wright's most beautiful job. So this consensus had arisen that Frank Lloyd Wright had created a masterwork that appealed not just to the architecture community, but to the general public. And over time, the house's popularity continued to grow. The Kaufmans hosted just about every mover and shaker of the modern movement at the house. So people like Frida Kahlo, Albert Einstein, Walter Gropius, Philip Johnson, Marcel Breuer, list goes on and on. They were all here at the house, admiring it and spreading the word about its significance. So one can say that the house marks a high point in Wright's career in American architecture, in the architecture of the 20th century, and really in all of architecture. And it's because of this commission that Wright's career gets reignited. He's propelled back onto the international scene, and he has the most prolific phase of his career starting after Fallingwater. So it's really this hinge point. Wright would go on to realize another 300 buildings before dying in 1959 after Fallingwater. So it really can't be understated the importance Fallingwater had for Frank Lloyd Wright's career. The Kaufmans' patronage of Frank Lloyd Wright was also pivotal to his success. And this house really dispelled any notion that Frank Lloyd Wright was just going to drift off into the distance and let those Europeans take his place. So that's the end of Act 1. So we'll go to Act 2. And this is where the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy comes into the picture. So Edgar Kaufman Sr. and Lillian Kaufman, the parents that own the department store, they both pass away in the 1950s. And Fallingwater passes on to Edgar Kaufman Jr. at that point. And while Edgar Kaufman Jr. loved Fallingwater, his life was firmly rooted in New York City. The family had actually sold the interest to the department store in the late 1940s, so there was very few ties keeping Edgar Kaufman Jr. in Pittsburgh. And he was following his passion for art and design. He ended up becoming the curator of industrial design at the Museum of Modern Art after succeeding Elliot Noyes, and then headed up MoMA's Good Design program from 1950 to 1955. And then after leaving MoMA, he goes on to start teaching architectural history at Columbia University. So his life was really in New York. And even though he would come out to Fallingwater on weekends from the city, it was difficult to maintain the house. And he also understood the importance of placing this landmark into the public domain. So in 1963, Edgar Kaufman Jr. donates Fallingwater to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. And I love this photograph. It's Edgar Kaufman Jr. passing off the deed to the then president of the Conservancy, Dr. Charles Lewis, and then witnessing that are the governor and first lady of Pennsylvania. So not a bad audience for this being transferred to a nonprofit organization. And in his dedication speech, Edgar Kaufman Jr. said that Fallingwater was not a house built by a man for a man, but a house built by man for man. So he thought that this house should not be a private indulgence, but instead be a public resource. And he decided against a typical house museum model. So rather than giving it to a preservation organization or to an art museum, he gives it to a land and water conservation organization, which directly aligned with the message of the architecture, which is one inspired by nature, one that's going to continue to evolve and change with the landscape around it, and one that would be conserved rather than preserved. Because of the house's remote location, the Western Pennsylvania and Edgar Kaufman Jr. thought that maybe a few hundred people would find their way to Fallingwater when the house opened in 1964. But that first year, over 30,000 people came to visit the house. And its popularity has continued to rise year after year, with visitation reaching in the 100,000s by the 70s, and today we host close to about 150,000 people a year. And Fallingwater has the distinction of being the first house of the modern movement to open as a museum. It's been a public site for 60 years, and it has been a public site with extremely wide exposure that entire time. And it's because of that accessibility to the public that Fallingwater helps to reinvigorate interest in Frank Lloyd Wright a second time. So if you think about when this house opened as a museum in the 1960s and the 1970s, the popularity of modern architecture was actually already kind of starting to wane. Modern buildings from the previous decades were disregarded as insignificant, many being neglected, many being torn down, and few were championing their preservation. And this even extended to Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings. 80 buildings by Frank Lloyd Wright were lost during this time period. That's almost 20% of his entire built legacy. So Wright's architecture, modern architecture in general, were at risk at this time. And the reason for this widespread disregard for modern architecture and even Wright's architecture was that by the 1960s, which is the start of the American preservation movement, this antagonistic relationship existed between modernism and preservation. Remember back to that period, preservation actually grew out of this desire to combat post-war urban renewal projects, where there was widespread demolition of historic and blighted neighborhoods for the replacement of that building stock with new modern buildings that would spark revitalization and economic reinvestment in our cities. And here's just an example from Pittsburgh. For the city's civic arena, which was this great work of modernism, had the world's largest retractable dome roof. but it required the mass demolition of over 10 square blocks of a historically African-American neighborhood and separated the city from its historic neighborhood stock. So preservationists at this time were instead focused on preserving what 18th and 19th century architecture was left, and viewed most modern buildings with a bit of a sense of disdain. So not only were these modern buildings the root cause of great loss, but preservationists considered them too young, too insignificant to preserve. And it's going to take a considerable change in attitude for modernism to start being viewed as not a negative force of social change, but one where it's architecturally, culturally significant and worthy of being saved. So Fallingwater plays a pivotal role in helping to change perceptions. And this is written by Theodore Proudhon in his book, Preserving Modernism. Fallingwater, being open to the public in 1964, provided visitors with an opportunity to experience the power and importance of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And because of Fallingwater's uniqueness and popularity, its broad appeal and iconic status, the house helped to shift perceptions of importance to save and share Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture and to save and share modernism more broadly. So Fallingwater helps to refocus public attention, adding buildings of a more recent vintage to the list of what should be preserved, along with 18th and 19th century buildings. And then, of course, Fallingwater is added to the National Register in 1974, becomes a National Historic Landmark in 1976, kind of, again, reaffirming its importance. And because Fallingwater's contribution to help raising awareness for the preservation of modernism, that donation of Fallingwater to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is regarded as one of the greatest acts of architectural philanthropy in the 20th century, and really helps to propel this idea of preserving modernism as something important, to do. So that's the end of Act 2, and then we'll go to the grand finale, which is World Heritage Inscription. In 2019, Fallingwater, along with 7 other Frank Lloyd Wright sites, were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, inscribed collectively as a serial nomination called the 20th Century Architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. So Fallingwater joined 24 other World Heritage Sites in the United States at this time. It's still the only inscription for modern architecture. But it's pretty remarkable to think that Fallingwater and Pennsylvania's others, Independence Hall and the Moravian Settlement, their cultural significance is now on level with places like the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal, the pyramids. I know that's a kind of a difficult comparison to put Fallingwater alongside the pyramids, but these are the places that are most important to us culturally in the world. And this inscription process literally took a lifetime. It began in 1982. So this is a process not for the faint of heart. It's an extremely political one, and one that takes a great will from not just the entities wishing to be inscribed, but through the National Park Service, the Department of Interior, and then the political landscape up and down the whole state, local, and federal levels. But it first started in 1982 with Taliesin and Taliesin West, Frank Lloyd Wright's homes, being added to the U.S. tentative list. So what happens in the United States for inscription is you first have to be added by the National Park Service to something called the tentative list for inscription, and then pulled from that tentative list on an annual basis are nominations that go to the formal World Heritage Committee for actual inscription. So that initial nomination in 1990 for Taliesin and Taliesin West failed. And then the National Park Service asked Fallingwater and the other 7 sites, along with the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, to pull together a nomination to put forth in 2014. And then that nomination was put forth in 2015, 2016. And that meeting was held in Turkey. So our previous director, Linda Wagner, went to go represent that nomination. And at the same time she was in Turkey, a coup was happening, so there were bombs going off in the distance. Unfortunately, the nomination was referred at that time and sent back to the drawing board. So we revised the entire nomination from 2016 to 2018, and then finally in 2019, Fallingwater and the 7 other sites were inscribed on the World Heritage List. So a huge, long, laborious process that a lot of credit is extended to the countless hours of staff, volunteers, government officials at every level for making this happen. So in addition to factors like authenticity, integrity, preservation of these sites, they have to have something called outstanding universal value. And that's kind of what we were talking about before, where these sites have a universal appeal and significance to all of humanity. They're significant from a global perspective, and they're some of the most remarkable places on the planet. So Fallingwater and the 7 other buildings selected aren't meant to represent different phases in Wright's career per se, and they're not meant to be the most admired of his works, but instead each of them has to represent this idea of outstanding universal value and stand on their own as culturally significant at an international scale. So the series was inscribed to the UNESCO World Heritage List under Criterion 2, which says that the work has an influence that has impacted global architecture and modern architecture on a worldwide scale. It also takes influences from other places and cultures and reinterprets it. That earlier nomination that got rejected, we actually tried to inscribe under the first criterion, which is to say that all of these works are a masterpiece of creative genius. But UNESCO prefers that serial inscriptions of multiple properties not be inscribed under that rule, but instead making sure that the body of work has this broader significance and impact to global architecture. So the Wright series was inscribed under these 3 attributes. I'm just going to go through these quick so you understand the justification for why these buildings are significant. So Wright's outstanding universal value is attributed to these ideas that his architecture is responsive to functional and emotional needs that he achieved through an abstraction of geometries and a unique manipulation of spatial relationships. That the design of his buildings are rooted in nature's forms and principles, and that gets back to his idea of organic architecture. And then finally, that the architecture is in response to an evolving American experience. And even though it's an American experience, it's still an experience that has universality in its understanding and significance and in its appeal. And Wright achieves this through the direct qualities of his organic architecture. Wright's claim to fame in terms of his contributions to modernism is this idea of the open plan, where we take down barriers between spaces and we create a flexible living space. You all live in them today, where your kitchen flows into your dining room, which flows into your living room. That started with Frank Lloyd Wright. So that's kind of at the heart of this idea of organic architecture, where he was blurring these transitions between inside and outside space. He used dramatic structural forms to achieve new shapes and expressions of design, and he used new materials and technologies to do that. He's always looking to nature as that direct inspiration for how he's playing off of shapes and design motifs and colors and how they all interact, tying his buildings intimately to the site. He's going to transform inspirations from other peoples, other cultures, primarily Japan, and he places a strong emphasis on this idea of the individual. He's designing for the individual American and for a particular experience. And all of these ideas have been acknowledged as being pivotal to the development of modern architecture, both in the United States and elsewhere in the 20th century. And the 8 properties, they span 50 years of Frank Lloyd Wright's career. And if you think about that time span from the early 20th century to the 1959, that's a huge period of technological change, of social change. And with each of these buildings, Wright's reinventing the building topology for worship, for housing, for leisure, for work, for education. So I just want to kind of quickly go through the 8 buildings for you and introduce you to them if you don't know them already. So hopefully you know this one. Fallingwater from 1936 in Mill Run, Pennsylvania. It's Wright's primary illustration of this idea of uniting architecture with nature. And all of this is made possible because he uses these dramatic cantilevers that project the house over the waterfall and make it float into space and mimics those rock ledges of the waterfalls. And throughout the house, he uses a limited palette of materials, colors, design motifs, all derived directly from the woodland site, and reiterates those throughout the structure to create this unified composition of landscape and of building. Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, from 1906 to 1909. It's one of the first truly modern buildings in its abstract cubic form and progression of spaces. It unites aesthetic intent and structure through the use of a single material, reinforced concrete, and the fact that this was being used for a non-industrial building and for a religious one was revolutionary at the time. And the interior space of Unity Temple breaks from all previous understandings in the Western world of how to enclose a religious space. So this really sets a new trajectory for religious architecture. Roby House in Chicago from 1910. It's the primary illustration of spatial continuity expressed through that open plan that we were talking about. And this is considered Wright's quintessential example of what he called the prairie style. So if you think about architecture in 1910, domestic architecture is really about vertical stacking of spaces. And instead here at the Roby House, he lays everything out on the horizontal and allows living spaces to freely flow one into the other, truly revolutionary. Taliesin, which was begun in 1911 in Spring Green. This is his Wisconsin home and studio in the base of the Taliesin Fellowship. But it's the primary expression of an architecture really seeming to grow directly out of its site. It just crawls out of the hillside, uses native materials and carefully planned vistas to directly tie the house into the surrounding farms and hills. I'm partial to this one. This is, other than Fallingwater, this is my favorite Frank Lloyd Wright house, Hollyhock House in Los Angeles from 1918 to 1921. It's the primary illustration of Wright transforming ideas from another culture into a completely new form and way. So it's basically a Spanish patio residence with a central courtyard where every living space connects directly to an exterior one, so that seamless blending of inside and outside space. And while it has some really elaborate Art Deco detailing and theatrical ornamentation, it's all intimately tied to the overall design and directly relates to the house, not just being a residence, but also being an arts center for Los Angeles, even when it was built. Jacob's House from Madison, Wisconsin, which is built in the same time as Fallingwater, 1936. But this is Wright's first Usonian house. Usonian was Wright's abbreviation for the United States of North America. And he saw this house form as a quintessential model for the modern American family. A house that was dependent on the automobile, that met the needs of a middle-class family, and one without servants. So this house was built on a standardized module that could then be expanded and easily replicated. So as your family grew, you could just add a couple more modules on. But all of these houses were tailor-fit to meet the needs of the individual family. And there's an interior view of Jacob's. Taliesin West, begun in 1938, Scottsdale, Arizona. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright's Arizona base for the Taliesin Fellowship. And this is known for blending seamlessly with its desert landscape, using rough volcanic stone directly from the site and creating this choreographed progression of spaces that kind of mimics the natural forms of the hills out in the landscape, but does it in a completely contemporary and modern way. And then we all know this one, the Guggenheim in New York from 1956 to 1959, is the primary illustration of how Wright adapted architecture to current needs for public space, using a circular form that completely disrupted the rectilinearity of the city. So it was just like a spaceship had landed in New York. but it was perfectly a great reflection of what was happening in modern art at the time. And it sets this model for museums where, well, this is a museum in the round, where the building itself is the primary work of art. And if you think of museums built from the Guggenheim on, they're always, the building itself is the primary work of art and the primary attraction. So these 8 sites, and there's that great interior view of the Guggenheim. So these 8 sites really reflect, each of them, outstanding universal value on a global scale, but they also show the impact of Frank Lloyd Wright's work on a global scale because of their influence. So not only is Wright influencing people in his own studio and working around him, but because his work was seen and published widely, he influences architects around the globe and even to the present day. So just like early associates in his office, like Walter Burley Griffin and Mary Mahoney Griffin, who go off to Australia and end up having remarkable careers in Australia and designing the capital of Australia, to over 500 Taliesin apprentices. We know these architects: Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, John Lautner, mid-century architects that were looking at his published work across the pond: Adolf Loos, Berlage, Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Alvar Aalto, and then the countless list of contemporary architects that directly share inspiration from Wright's work, like Zaha Hadid, Sir Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Tadao Ando, Frank Gehry. They all credit Wright as being some of their primary points of inspiration. So I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that World Heritage inscription is primarily honorific, just like inscription on the National Register of Historic Places or being designated a National Historic Landmark. Listing doesn't impose any new regulations or restrictions on properties, so UNESCO has no real legal oversight. United Nations has no oversight over the properties once they're inscribed. So it's just the existing state, local, federal protections, as well as any easements that are on the property. And of course, we rely on the professional management of these sites for their long-term preservation. However, to ensure that there was a coordinated effort going on between the 8 sites for preservation, for long-term preservation, we did establish something called the Frank Lloyd Wright World Heritage Council, which I have the honor of currently chairing, and we meet twice a year, where we all hold each other accountable, and we serve as a collective network and collective resource to one another. So we work together to promote our inscriptions. So what, we're on the World Heritage List? What does that mean? Why is that important to us? We use this network to gather necessary reporting documents. We're required to submit state of preservation to both our National Park Service and to the World Heritage Committee on a regular basis. But what its real power is just being able for all of these site managers to sit around the table and exchange ideas and best practices on interpretation and preservation and how we can all work to promote the legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright. So this inscription confirms that Fallingwater and Frank Lloyd Wright has an importance to social, cultural, and architectural history. And it reaffirms the relevance of Frank Lloyd Wright to a world audience and for generations to come. World Heritage designation is also an international standard. It's kind of like the gold standard, the rubber stamp for international tourism. So it can boost international tourism to our Commonwealth. And so we're currently working on an international ad campaign. If you've flown United at all recently and pulled out the magazine from the back of the seat, you would have seen an ad for Fallingwater. So we're hoping that what this does is, again, use a different avenue to attract international audience to Pennsylvania. And we have seen growth in international tourism. Big part of that is the fact that now to the Pittsburgh International Airport, we have a daily direct flight to London. So that's bringing a lot of people directly to our region. And if you come to the Western Pennsylvania, you also have two other Frank Lloyd Wright sites, Kentuck Knob and Polymath Park. So you can see kind of a full scope of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And in addition to that educational benefit of seeing multiple Frank Lloyd Wright works, there's the economic impact to our entire Western Pennsylvania region. We did an economic impact study and showed that tourism to our three sites throughout the Western Pennsylvania region has an annual economic impact of $90 million, so huge to the local economy. And at Fallingwater, we continue to build upon our World Heritage inscription. So just beyond the public tour program, we're also doing a lot of educational programming to, again, advance Wright's ideas to ensure his relevance to younger generations. So we do a lot of educational outreach to public schools, both virtually and in person. We host high school and college students and teachers for week-long residencies at our facility called High Meadow, which is on our grounds and can sleep up to 20 people for multi-day learning experiences. We invite artists and scholars and residents onto our site to put new lenses over Fallingwater to reinterpret the site's meaning and to connect in different ways. So this is a plein air painter, Ron Donahue, who spent over 2 years painting plein air at Fallingwater. And here's a British weaver named Eleanor Pritchard who took patterns of the architecture and transformed them into new textile designs. And we're advancing Wright's ideas of living in harmony with nature through new sustainability initiatives. And if you think about Wright, his ideas really are kind of a foundation of our contemporary green and sustainable movements, where this idea of landscape and architecture can be harmonious and can connect people to the natural world and deepen our understanding of its importance. So we're constantly looking for ways to use the lessons of Wright's organic architecture to educate in new ways about how to build sustainably. And we don't just do that through education, but we do that through our site-wide operations. So just 2 years ago, we installed a solar array on our grounds that offsets about 25% of the entire campus's electricity consumption. So Fallingwater has a 5,000-acre reserve and over 20 buildings that we're managing. So this has a major impact in helping to start getting us off the grid. And we also have a LEED Silver certified event and conference center in our barn at Fallingwater, which is hooked up to a zero discharged wastewater treatment facility, so all the flush water gets recycled. And plus, this building has geothermal heating, which really cuts down on its energy consumption. We also leveraged our World Heritage inscription to garner support for a comprehensive preservation repair to the entire building. So we're replacing all of the roofing assemblies on the flat roofs and under the stone terraces, all of the flashings on the building, comprehensive repointing of all of the masonry, repair of deteriorated areas of reinforced concrete, and conservation of all the steel of the windows and doors to the tune of close to $7 million over the next 3 years. And because of World Heritage inscription, we were able to successfully fundraise for that. Half of that funding did come directly from our Commonwealth through the State Redevelopment Assistance Capital Program. So preserving and sharing Fallingwater has further dividends in just, again, promoting that legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright. And just to put that legacy in perspective, so Frank Lloyd Wright's 70-year career, he designed over 1,000 structures, saw 500 of those structures realized. About 20% of that building stock has been lost through demolition and neglect, leaving about 400 of Wright's buildings still standing. Most of those in the United States, 1 in Canada, and 4 in Japan. But it's important to realize, even though that seems like a huge number and a prolific number of buildings for an architect, over half of those existing buildings have no protections attached to them. Most of them are in private hands. So they could be demolished or heavily altered or neglected. So it's really important that our UNESCO World Heritage designation, the work that all of our sites are doing to promote the relevance of right ensures that those threats do not impact those structures and that right's legacy continues to live on. So the benefits of inclusion on the World Heritage List are obviously many. The overall impacts are proving to be immeasurable for our sites, not just through growth of tourism, but just growth of awareness. And for Fallingwater and for Wright, it just recognizes the house's irreplaceable legacy, its importance on a global scale. But as we all know, the significance of places ebbs and flows, so we always have to remain vigilant in our promotion of their importance. And through that, we can use Wright's legacy to inspire better ways of living through art, through design, and through a direct connection to nature. Thank you so much. Does anyone have questions? Yeah.
Hello. Is it working? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for coming and sharing with us today.
Of course.
I've always wondered, as you mentioned, Frida Kahlo visited there.
Yeah.
When most of the world knew her only as the wife of an artist, the Kaufmans bought 3 paintings.
Absolutely.
One, My Birth, the most shocking one, that Edgar sells directly to Madonna. One self-portrait with cropped hair that ends up at MoMA, connected to him working there. And a third one that's lost in a fire. But I've always wondered, at any point, do we know if any of those paintings hung at Fallingwater?
We don't know that. So, of course, we have 2 Riveras that hang in the house. And we certainly know that Frida Kahlo came and stayed at Fallingwater and took photographs of the house. But whether or not those Kahlos ever hung in the house, we don't know. But there's a great story, and I don't know if you know this one, about My Birth, which hung in Edgar Kaufman. We do know it hung in Edgar Kaufman Jr.'s apartment in New York. And it's a rather risque painting, as you know. So he always hid it inside of a closet. So he would do a little peep show for guests. And if he liked you, he'd take you to the closet and open the door and surprise you with My Birth. But yeah, Madonna did end up buying that, and it's still in her collection. I think she recently loaned it out for an exhibition. I'd love to see if she'd loan it to Fallingwater, and we could at least show it for some time in the house, which would be great. But we have no climate control, so I'm not sure that would happen. But there's always hope. But yeah, the Kaufmans were patrons of both Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. As our audience member mentioned, bought 3 Kahlo works. The first Kahlo to go to the Museum of Modern Art was purchased by Edgar Kaufman Jr. and donated by him. So they were pivotal players in kind of the early American popularity of both, well, primarily Kahlo. Rivera was already kind of on the scene, but really for Kahlo. So thanks for bringing that up. It's fascinating history. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Justin. Since
thanks
we're in the State Museum of Pennsylvania, your talk is being sponsored by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, effectively, so I can be shamelessly chauvinistic, and I wanted to just reaffirm this. You mentioned that I think there are 26 sites located across 22 states, and I just consulted with Professor Google.
Okay.
He confirms that. I also note that there are only 8 states that have more than 1 listing.
And we have 3.
And we have 3. Only one other state seems to have 3. It's California.
Okay.
But of our 3, all 3 are cultural sites,
okay.
which I think is interesting. But that leads me to a substantive question, which is, I know that the UNESCO allows for both cultural and natural sites. Hawaii has 1 site that's considered both cultural and natural. Giving Fallingwater's, symbiotic.
So we should be cultural and natural.
Just throwing it out there. Was that ever considered when they were throwing it out for nomination?
I think there has to be more of a history to the natural importance, but I love that idea. That would be great. But how wonderful that Pennsylvania has 3, the most of any state on cultural World Heritage designation. And I guess the others in California would be Yosemite. I don't remember what the
There's
other
2
one.
others, but I mean, we are often, people often remark on how Pennsylvania has slipped from its national rankings, you know, in terms of
Well,
population.
we have international rankings.
Yeah, we have international. I would argue, also interesting to note that the big 3 states ahead of us, well, we already mentioned California, but Florida and New York only have 1, which I think is fascinating to think of us having 3 relative to those 2 larger states.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and I love this idea in Pennsylvania of, you know, Independence Hall kind of being the foundations of American democracy on one end of the state, and on the other end of the state you have Fallingwater, which is kind of this whole idea of propelling the foundations of American democracy through architecture in a totally new way. So I kind of love that dialogue between the 2 ends of our state with our World Heritage. Yeah.
Has anybody written a biography of Edgar Kaufman Jr.? I think that would be fascinating.
It would be fascinating. You know, he's regarded as probably one of the most influential curators of modern design. So if you did a Venn diagram of intersections or kind of the degrees of separation mapping of Edgar Kaufman Jr. to every mover and player of the modern movement, he's going to be somewhere in the middle of all of those intersections. So I'll do a little shameless plug here, but we're putting out a new book next year with Rizzoli on the art collection at Fallingwater. And of course that dives deeply into Edgar Kaufman Jr.'s roles in the family's ties to artists and designers. So while it's not a biography, it definitely does need to be done because he's a fascinating character for sure, and one deserving of having his story told.
Okay. First of all, Justin, thank you for the presentation. But my question in regard with the Kaufmans, obviously they would have done the research with architects before choosing Lloyd Wright for Fallingwater. My question is, how were they cool with him with his increase in cost? Because I'm sure they would have done their research, you know, from other people say, you know, this guy is kind of known to increase his budget daily, and it's like, how would they be fine with it? Besides, obviously, they had the money.
They weren't fine with it.
Yeah. But my thing is, were they just because he was a good salesman, or how was he able to convince them, despite the fact, you know, they gave him the initial cost, oh, for sure, $35,000, but obviously by the end of 39, I'm sure.
Why
it was
not
more
just
than
kick him
that.
to the curb and move on with
Yeah,
some other
exactly.
architect? Yeah. I think Frank Lloyd Wright was so successful and so prolific because he was able to sell his ideas to his clients. And not just with the Kaufmans, but with many of his clients, they were lifetime patrons. So even outside of Fallingwater, the Kaufmans are writing checks to Frank Lloyd Wright all the way until he dies in 1959. And then even after Frank Lloyd Wright dies in 1959, Edgar Kaufman Jr. is still writing checks to Olga Vanna Wright, his wife, until she dies, until Edgar Kaufman Jr. dies. So they really bought into the philosophy, fell in love with the idea of organic architecture, and were willing to spend the money. However, if you read all of the correspondence back and forth between the clients and the architect, there's some really heated back and forth on many occasions. And how many of you have been to Fallingwater? So most of you have been there, and you probably heard the story on your tour about the desk in Edgar Kaufman Sr.'s bedroom being enlarged. So it was really a much shorter desk. And then Edgar Kaufman Jr. wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright saying, if you need me to keep writing your checks, you'll make my desk bigger. So the desk doubles in size. So there's a playful banter, often heated back and forth, but they stick with him because they were realizing something really remarkable was happening, and they had the resources to follow through.
Are those things that you referenced, these letters that are out there,
Yeah.
will they eventually be put on display?
So all of those letters exist at the Avery Archives in New York, so anyone can go and look at them, and many of them have been scanned so that you can even see them online. Yeah.
Thank you for the excellent talk. I'm curious, you said that UNESCO doesn't have a required set of standards that they hold inscribed sites to, but
There are standards that you have to meet, but
Okay.
they have no jurisdiction over enforcing.
That was
They can
my-
take you off the list.
I was curious
Yeah.
how inscription might have changed how you steward or conserve the site versus how you did before inscription.
Yeah, that's a great question. So really to make sure that we're meeting muster to get inscribed, all of the sites had to prove that their preservation standards were meeting the highest of standards. So all of those sites that are part of the serial nomination abide by the Secretary of the Interior standards for preservation. They meet all of the criteria to become a National Historic Landmark. They have a protective easement in place to ensure long-term preservation if ownership changes. So all of those are in place, at least in the United States, before you even have an opportunity to apply. So you have to prove that you're meeting all of those standards to even be considered for inscription. So in terms of how we've changed our approach, I'd say we might not necessarily have changed our approach, but we're more informed with how we do the work because we're working now kind of collectively across sites, holding one another accountable. And if someone's doing something in a different way that seems to make more sense, but still meets the guidelines and the standards, then that's a great opportunity for all of us to kind of adapt and change together to improve. So hope that answers your question. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I can talk really loudly though. As you mentioned, Frank Lloyd Wright designs an office for Kaufman for the
Yeah.
department store.
Yeah.
It is now in the V&A
Yeah.
in London and now installed in their new satellite museum. Do you think that was...
Can I hire you as a docent for Fallingwater?
Certainly. So do you think this was a great loss for Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, or do you think being in the most important design museum in the world and it becomes almost an ambassador because there aren't any Frank Lloyd Wright sites
Exactly.
in Europe? And is part of that flight between London and Pittsburgh, are you going to partner and try and get people visit the office and see Frank and
Yeah.
then see Fallingwater
Yeah.
and vice versa?
Yeah, you answered your own question. Yeah.
Okay.
So Edgar Kaufman Jr. understood the value of having that space at the V&A. So it's now the only Frank Lloyd Wright space in Europe. So the power that it can have with that audience, and now that it will be permanently installed in their new research facility to be publicly accessible at all times, that's going to have a huge, huge impact and hopefully Wright's popularity in London and for everyone going to visit that facility. So that's why it didn't end up at an institution in the US, because Edgar Kaufman Jr. saw the value of it being across the pond and in the UK. So yeah, I think that's yet another reason to kind of promote Pittsburgh, London tourism, so that people that now know that can come see our resources in southwestern Pennsylvania. But yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, it had been in storage since like the 90s, late 90s, so off of view. So it's really exciting that it's getting back on public view.
Yeah, I've seen it in the permanent V&A building.
Yeah.
I think its display was relatively...
Yeah, they had kind of shortened it or truncated it down. Exactly. Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So now we all have to go to London. And if you don't know about Frank Lloyd Wright's another office that Frank Lloyd Wright designed for himself, for his office in San Francisco, so it was his San Francisco base of operations. That office was taken out of its original building in San Francisco. It went briefly to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and then was sold, deaccessioned and sold, and it's now been reinstalled, beautifully reinstalled, at the Hagen History Center in Erie. So we have another Frank Lloyd Wright resource in Pennsylvania. So come to Pittsburgh, see Fallingwater, Kentucky Polymath Park, drive north to Erie, see the San Francisco office, and then make a right and go over to Buffalo and see the Darwin Martin House and all of the great architecture in Buffalo. So, anything else? Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
So I'd like again to thank Justin for bringing some of Fallingwater's magic here to Harrisburg today. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Commonwealth Media Services for helping set up and record today's program, and our staff, Kurt Miner, the curator of the Fallingwater exhibit, and Beth Erickson, who helped organize today. I do hope you've had the opportunity to visit Fallingwater, as Justin said, and if you haven't had the chance, that this inspires you to get out there. It really is extraordinary. And obviously, for those of you who've been, you know that once isn't enough either. I also would like to mention that we do have one additional program related to Fallingwater that's upcoming. On Saturday, November 2nd, the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation, which is our nonprofit affiliate, and Historic Harrisburg Association will be providing a bus tour out to Fallingwater and Flight 93 Memorial. So if you're interested, please go to the Heritage Foundation's website and you can register there, or you can speak with David Morrison, who happens to be here today. It should be a great trip. So again, thank you for spending time with us here today, and we hope that you'll join us for some upcoming programs. Have a great day.